the Russians have got this extraordinary ability to take punishment. We saw it in the Second World War, and they'll just grind on and on and on. And this brings us, I think, to the biggest danger. I think the biggest danger is that Putin says to Trump, actually, if you don't mind, I'm not going to do a deal. I'm just going to keep going. And then what happens?
We heard from Trump's national security advisor that the president-elect could speak to President Putin as early as next week about the war in Ukraine. What do you expect to hear from that conversation? And do you think that's starting to lay the groundwork for a potential deal between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that President Trump is going to tackle this fairly early on in his term. He said so. And actually, if you look back over his sort of record, when he says he's going to do something, he tends to do it. So I think he'll talk to the Russians fairly early on. He's appointed a rather good general, Keith Kellogg, to be his front man on Ukraine, which is quite encouraging. And Marco Rubio at the State Department is quite good on Ukraine as well. But I think there are some substantial worries. I think one of them is, does Putin actually want an agreement? Actually, if you looked at it from Putin's point of view, although he's losing a huge number of people and a lot of equipment, he is making progress. And if you looked at it from his point of view, you know, the Ukrainians are struggling to find manpower and want a pause rather more than the Russians do. So, you know, Putin may calculate to himself, actually, he might say to Trump, actually, Donald, if you don't mind, I'm just going to keep going. And that would be a worry. But let's put that to one side, because let's hope. I mean, I think Putin will see the sense of coming to an agreement with Trump, and not not sort of ignoring Trump's peace outreach. So say they do come to an agreement, then I think that, say they do decide to talk, I think there are then a couple of really, really interesting points that then flow from that. The first one is, do the Europeans get a seat at the table? I can actually see a situation in which Trump says, well, actually, let's not complicate it. Let's just do Russia, United States, and possibly Ukraine, at the table. And so that's sort of one option. If you remember back to the Afghan agreement, the Doha Accords, the Europeans weren't really at the table. It was just done between Trump and the Afghans, and the Taliban, in fact. So that is a question. On the other hand, if, as I think is generally accepted as likely, that Trump will say, look, for guarantees for Ukraine's future, it's up to Europe, not the United States, to finance it and to provide the troops. Now, I think this was slightly implicit in what Keir Starmer said yesterday in Kyiv, when he was asked the question, would Britain be willing to send troops to police the border? And he said, yes, we will do our part. And he thought Macron would too. So I think, generally speaking, the Europeans have got the impression, and I think it's probably a good impression, that Trump will want a ceasefire, will want a deal, but will want Europe to provide the peacekeeping forces in a future Ukraine. And therefore, from that point of view, then Europe does have to be at the negotiating table, which is sort of good news. The less good news is the only guarantee that really is worth the paper it's written on is the NATO guarantee, the Article 5 guarantee, which says that if one NATO country is invaded, the others will come to its aid. Now, United States, Germany, Slovakia, and Hungary, and possibly Austria, none of those are prepared to give that guarantee, it seems, the NATO membership to Ukraine. So if it doesn't have NATO membership, what guarantee does Ukraine have that Russia isn't just going to attack again? Well, this is the idea of putting European troops into Ukraine. Well, firstly, Putin may just absolutely reject that notion and say, I'm not having that. But then the other question is, how many troops would it require? Now, it's a 1,200-mile border, a lot longer than the Korean border. and in Korea there are tens of thousands of American troops. So we need a lot of troops, British, French, I would guess Polish probably, and various other nations would have to stump up troops to patrol the border. Then the question is, are they actually right at the border, or are they in neighboring towns like Kharkov or Sumy or Dnipro or Zaporizhia, back from the border? The danger of being back from the border is that allows Russia to invade 10, 15, 20 miles before actually coming into contact with European troops. And therefore, it's not really acting as a tripwire. If they're right forward at the border, it means that if Russia suddenly decides it's going to crack on again, then you're in a situation in which European countries have to decide, are we going to war? And I mean, I don't know what you think here, but I mean, I really struggle to believe that if Russian troops advanced beyond the agreed line in the face of Polish troops or French troops, that Europe is ready and willing to go to war with Russia, which could have all sorts of consequences, including use of nuclear weapons further down the line and stuff like this. So it seems to me there are some really massive problems still to be discussed and to be overcome, and not least, incidentally, the question of Britain. I mean, do we have the troops? We find it hard to provision Estonia with 800 troops. We've got some troops in Cyprus. The British Army is the smallest level it's ever been. Could we really supply a meaningful number of troops to Ukraine, given our other commitments elsewhere? I think there's a real question mark over that. So, this whole thing is we're really moving into very unknown territory. It's going to be very, very interesting diplomacy in the weeks ahead, and the United States and Europe are really going to have to be on their game, not to get bested by Putin's diplomatic efforts. Because the other point I think is worth remembering, we're talking as if Putin's sort of somehow sitting in the box seat and that he's in a good position, but he's not. I mean, his invasion has been a catastrophe of Ukraine. He's only taken 17% of Ukraine. He wanted 100% of it. He's lost vast numbers of troops and of equipment. So it would be a real pity to hand him a diplomatic victory on the back of what has been a catastrophic decision of his.
Even if Putin's ambitions don't change, you mentioned there's this consensus among the West that Putin, he might agree to stop further incursions into Europe. But on the other hand, if we were to look at Russia domestically in terms of Putin's reputation among Russians, how do you think that's going to fare? And do you think that will potentially inhibit his ambitions for further incursions?
I think internally, I mean, of course, we never really know because Russia is a very impenetrable place. We never really know how safe Putin is. But my view would be that Putin is in a very strong position in Russia. I think he's a strong man. I think Russians like strong leadership. Incidentally, I think if he were removed, it would be undoubtedly for someone worse, not someone better. I mean, Navalny is dead. Boris Nemtsov is dead. Kara-Murza is in exile. I mean, there is no one. There's no one liberal to take over. And anyway, Russians don't particularly like liberal leaders. They like strong leaders. So I think Putin's actually pretty safe. The way he's run the war in Ukraine is quite clever. So he's drawn people from, he hasn't drawn the troops from middle classes or from Moscow or from St. Petersburg. He's drawn them from, the Far East and sort of middling towns in the east and south and north and so forth. And therefore that has sort of reduced the unpopularity to an extent. And of course, as we know, he's actually had to withdraw. He's had to rely on North Korean troops. I mean, the fact that he's asked North Korea to help shows what a poor position he's in a way. But I think the chances of Putin being overthrown are absolutely minimal. I think there have been chances in the past when Ukraine was doing very well on the battlefield. I'm talking about 18 months ago when they retook Kharkiv, when they retook Kherson. I think there possibly were moments when the Russian army could have mutinied. And if you remember, there was that remarkable Prigozhin coup attempt, where Putin, I think, was at his moment of greatest peril. But now the Russians are beginning to make progress again. I think those dangers of him being overthrown are gone. So the Russians have got this extraordinary ability to take punishment. We saw it in the Second World War. And they'll just grind on and on and on. And this brings us, I think, to the biggest danger. I think the biggest danger is that Putin says to Trump, actually, if you don't mind, I'm not going to do a deal. I'm just going to keep going. And then what happens? Do you
see Trump letting him do that, though?
I don't know what Trump would do, what he could do to stop it. Because obviously Putin would like the sanctions to be relieved and so forth. But as I say, Russia does have this ability to take punishment.
Days before Donald Trump is sworn in as US president, Starmer and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a 100-year partnership treaty in Kyiv, covering areas including defence, science, energy and trade. Starmer's been speaking to Sky News' Beth Rigby as well, their political editor, about Britain's position in Ukraine.
Well, I've been discussing this with a number of allies, including, of course, President Macron, including President Zelensky here today, and we will play our full part. We have always been one of the leading countries in relation to defence of Ukraine, and so you can read into that that we will be playing our full part.
OK. Cormac Smith is former special advisor to Ukraine's foreign minister and joins us here on the show. Cormac, good evening to you.
Hello, Kate. Nice to join you.
Yeah, really lovely to speak to you. Look, just expanding on what we heard from Keir Starmer today, speaking to Sky News, to Beth Rigby. He says, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but the UK will and does want to play a full part in any peace negotiations. And that includes the UK deploying British troops for peacekeeping, a peacekeeping force. And this is quite an interesting point, isn't it? Because there has long been discussion about whether sort of, NATO aligned or NATO pumped peacekeeping force could monitor the border around Ukraine, and whether that would be a satisfactory part of a peace deal, sort of what this looks like going forward effectively.
Seems to be cart before horse to me. This is assuming that there is going to be some sort of a peace deal. And, I spoke to a number of friends in Kyiv today, and Sir Keir is definitely very, very welcome. Britain has been among, if not the greatest supporter of Ukraine over the last 3 horrible years of this war, and is greatly appreciated as such, although I did detect some scepticism or worry when the government changed and people were asking the question, would Keir Starmer's Labour Party be quite so strong on supporting Ukraine? But, the thing that concerns me more than anything else, we've heard, and we have consistently for the last 6 months, we have heard all the correct words from this Labour government on Ukraine. We have yet to see the substance. And the substance, comes down to how much we spend on defence. And it was Sir Roland Walker, the current head of the British Army, who said before Christmas that the British Army is not ready to fight. And if it's not ready to fight, we're not ready to deter. Keir Starmer has said he would raise defence spending up to 2.5% when we can afford it. And he has, in one interview I heard before Christmas, he has ruled out countenancing a raise to 3%, which is the increasing consensus around Europe, and certainly what Donald Trump will ask for. So while we may well be able to contribute to this peacekeeping force, a very senior former military man I spoke to earlier on today said the British Army could do that, but they probably couldn't do much else. So a lot of very warm words. Obviously, none of us, certainly not Keir Starmer or Volodymyr Zelensky, will be around in 100 years' time. So I'm not really sure what sense it makes to talk about
optics
100-year.
Anything else? Yeah, it feels like a very long commitment, doesn't it?
We don't need optics at the moment, Kate. We need substance. You know, the real attention in Kyiv at the moment is on the 20th of January, Monday, I think, and what's going to happen. Now, Donald Trump has said he would end this war on day one. Personally, I don't think he will. And I've noticed Donald Trump being a little bit more nuanced in his comments on Ukraine recently. I think he's realizing just how intractable a situation it is. But certainly, if we look at the noises coming out of Moscow, they are not in any way emollient, and they are not in any way suggesting that Moscow is in any mood for compromise at the moment. Notably, today they hit Kyiv with a 50 drone attack, almost certainly to coincide with the Prime Minister's visit and to send out a very, very strong message. There's some very belligerent language coming out of the Kremlin and out of the Security Council of the Russian Federation at the moment.
Yeah, look, I mean, let's just sort of lean into Donald Trump's inauguration and his arrival at the White House. We've heard more recently, so we did hear the kind of day one line, didn't we? Wants it done on day one. But I think he's now resolved to end it within, the retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg extended the deadline. This is someone close to Trump, and said that his personal goal was to resolve it within 100 days. So I see what you're saying there about, you know, Trump becoming a little bit softer in his approach to exactly when he wants to get that done. Perhaps he understands the difficulty involved, as you say. But I wonder whether Keir Starmer's visit is timed deliberately, or has been timed deliberately, to take place before Donald Trump assumes office on Monday.
I think there's no doubt that it has been. But could I say one other thing, Kate? You know, there's a lot of talk about what Trump will do. We've got to remember the Ukrainians have a say in this. And I think we sometimes forget and we deny agency to the Ukrainian people. A very good friend of mine, a senior diplomat, said to me only a few days after the full-scale invasion back in 2022, he said, it's very simple, Cormac. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. And if a bad deal were to be imposed on Ukraine by the threat of Donald Trump pulling all support away from Ukraine, which I certainly hope doesn't happen, and freezing the lines of engagement where they are and giving some sort of security guarantees to Ukraine, not that those security guarantees have been worth the paper they were written on in the past, example, the Budapest Memorandum, that will be spun by Vladimir Putin as a victory to his own people. He will, at the moment, the Russian economy is in free fall, and according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and a figure that our security services agree closely with, the Russians are losing in the region between 1,500 and 2,000 men a day, either killed or very, very badly wounded and taken out of the battle. So, you know, Putin badly needs a break. He needs to lick his wounds and he needs to rebuild his forces. Whatever he agrees, we know that Russia, in relation to Ukraine, certainly always negotiates in bad faith and always breaks their word.
Earlier this week, we had the president-elect Donald Trump. He wanted to see NATO allies spending around 5% of their GDP on defense spending, especially with Trump coming into office on Monday. How do we see NATO allies responding to this? We've had mixed reviews so far about increasing their defense spending, but what do you think on that?
Well, I think many of them, even those who spend a lot of money on defense, will probably think that the Trump goal of 5%, if that really is the goal, because of course Trump isn't yet president, so none of what he says, if you like, is official US policy yet, at least not until Monday. So I think many of them will think, well, 5%, no, we're probably not going to get there because it would bankrupt our economies. You know, in the case of Germany, they would have to find an extra 200 billion euros. Very difficult, particularly with the German economy now in recession 2 years in a row. And even America itself spends 3.4%. So their not at 5% either. So I think most of the people in NATO will see this as a kind of Trump starting point. He likes to sort of set the bar high for his initial negotiating position. But I think many of them will realize that when Trump comes to Europe for the NATO summit in The Hague in June, he's going to expect at least more than 2%, which is the current NATO target, even if 9 allies currently aren't at 2%. So I think that this is the beginning of a bit of a negotiation as to where we're going to come out. And I think most allies will probably think that between 2% and 5%, they're going to come out by June at around 3%, 3.5%. But again, this is going to be difficult because it's all very well to set these targets, but it's another thing to find the resources to really meet them. As I mentioned, there's only recently, in the last year or so, have the bulk of allies actually got up to the 2% mark.
And the Secretary General, he did suggest that there could be joint buying of weapons, equipment, and innovation, which could, in general, reduce the amount of funding that's required per NATO ally on their defence spending. What do you make of that?
Well, absolutely, because it's one thing to have a lot of money, but as you know, you can waste a lot of money very easily. And defence is an area where you can really waste money quickly if you don't have cooperation. For example, in Europe, we still have 16 different types of shipyards, 5 different types of fighter aircraft. It's estimated by the European Parliament that the EU member states of NATO waste about 100 billion euros a year in duplication of programs, different countries, different tanks and all of that. So there's no doubt about it. If you can have more standardization around one dominant system, one aircraft, one tank, one shipyard, one type of frigate, you're going to save a lot of money. So the taxpayers, I think, will not accept to spend a lot of extra money on defense if they don't see evidence that that money is being spent more wisely. So that's one part of the challenge. But the second part of the challenge is that it's no good also having a lot of extra money for defense if you don't have the defense industry production lines, which have the tools, the materials, the chemicals, the metallurgy, to be able to translate that money into weapons. You can't fight with dollar bills. You can only fight with shells and tanks. And we know that NATO has had problems in the past getting defense industry to adequately stockpile its systems. There's been this difficult debate that, if I give a Patriot air defense system to Ukraine, I'm leaving myself vulnerable, and so should I do it? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. So I think the other side of all of this is not just reduce duplication, but is to get defense industry to really open up the production lines so that you can efficiently translate this money quickly into the kind of stockpiles we need. If defense industry takes 20 years to produce new systems, and NATO generals are warning about the prospect of a war with Russia, hypothetically in 2 or 3 years, you can see the kind of bind that NATO is going to be in.
And surely manpower plays into that as well. I mean, last month it was revealed that 1/5 of the UK armed forces, they're not fit to fight, according to the MOD. How significant a part do you think that plays into this as well?
Well, it's the same of all NATO armies. For example, Portugal a few years ago, although it was a few years ago, was spending the bulk of its military salaries on pensions for its colonial army from Africa from the 1960s and 70s. So clearly there is a need to change what NATO calls the tooth to tail ratio. In other words, in any defense budget, that part which is actually fighting troops in the front line and equipping them and training them, and that part which is people sitting behind desks. Of course, you need people sitting behind desks, but dealing with procurement and logistics and administration and all of those kind of things. And that's been a problem, I think, for all of NATO armies in the past. In other words, you have a large army, but how much of that army is deployable within a couple of days, has the equipment, the training necessary to go into the front line immediately. And so that, yes, is going to be, I think, a considerable challenge for everybody. But at the same time, it's also a challenge for countries like the UK, because on the one hand, you have to raise the size of the army, which is the smallest that it's been, 70,000 since the Napoleonic Wars. But on the other hand, there's a need to replace a lot of equipment, as we know as well. And so balancing what you spend on manpower or women power and what you spend on equipment, getting that into the right kind of order, not easy. And that's why people like the NATO Secretary General believe that if that issue is going to be fixed, 3% or 4% of GDP on defense is going to be the baseline. You're not really going to be able to do both of those, manpower and equipment, with just a 2%. So yes, difficult choices ahead for governments, particularly when they look at things like education and social spending and other priorities as well, and making the case with voters that defence has to have a higher priority in the pecking order, where it's been coming down that pecking order since the end of the Cold War. Not an easy political job either.
And as I mentioned before, we've got Trump's inauguration on Monday. Yesterday, we saw questioning of Trump's nomination for Defense Secretary. We didn't have too much on what he might do in terms of Russia and Ukraine. It was very vague about that. But in his book, he did write that NATO is a relic, at best a distraction. It should be scrapped and remade. What sort of picture does that paint for the US's relationship with NATO moving forward from Monday?
Well, it's easier to sell books, quite frankly, or newspaper articles. That if you write NATO is a relic and should be replaced, you're going to get more attention that way than if you write that NATO is a perfectly good organization. People say a lot of things when they're out of office, or they're in new media jobs, of course, as this gentleman was beforehand with Fox News. Once they're in office, they tend to see things very differently. I mean, let me just give you an example, Ukraine, where we heard on the campaign trail, not just from Trump, but from Trump supporters, that he would solve the issue before he got to the Oval Office, or he would solve it in 24 hours. Now, even before the inauguration, they're all saying, no, of course, we didn't really mean that. We recognize it can't even be done in 100 days. It's going to take several months. It's going to be difficult. Trump even said publicly that it was going to be more difficult to get peace in Ukraine than peace in the Middle East. So you see already the dawn of realism, aspiration hitting reality, if you like. And I think you're going to see more of this. And a lot of the criticism was basically to simply, give NATO a bit of a shake-up. To spend more money on defense. And I remember from being in previous meetings with Trump when I was a NATO official that he claimed credit for saving NATO, not for getting rid of it, by saying that his shock therapy was what was required to get the Europeans to spend more money on defense. And ultimately, he should be given the credit for making NATO stronger, not NATO weaker. So, we've heard a lot on the campaign trail. After Monday, you're right, the real business of governing, of making tough decisions is there. And I think people like the incoming Secretary of Defense will realize very well that his job is going to be massively easier in keeping American troops safe and in protecting American interests around the world if he's got 31 allies in NATO than if he doesn't have those allies and the United States is totally alone.
I'm a comedian by trade. I think of things on a basic human level. Who would you rather negotiate with, the Biden administration or Donald Trump? It's sort of like, getting in your request for annual leave before there's a new boss. You sort of think, I'll get that in now because this person coming in seems like a bit of a loose cannon and I can't predict him. I mean, I did feel optimistic, but everything that Ashley said did make sense. I suppose, the good thing about feeling optimistic is that in a global sense, we haven't felt that for a while. And it's just interesting to remember what it feels like to have some sense in a forward perspective that things could improve, but yeah, it's not to denigrate the complexities on the ground. But with the Ukraine situation as well, at the very least, things might not be as bad as they've been.
In most democracies, the law would apply, and you wouldn't become immune. You would not become immune from prosecution just by getting into government again. So to us, that is a very strange notion. And of course, what it will always be deeply worrying what happened on January 6th, 4 years ago, the storming of the Capitol. But he is going to be the president again. Everybody is going to have to deal with him. He's going to be the most powerful man in the world, in the democratic world. And so, to some extent, governments have to just move on and deal with that, and literally deal with it, because the main thing about him is he sees himself as a deal maker. Remember last time how much he chased a deal with North Korea, with Kim Jong-un, which was very unlikely to happen. But he really chased after that deal. He wanted to show that he can settle a thing that had been disputed for decades. And so he may not succeed in those things, but that's the thing to remember about him. When he says something, He's looking for a deal. He's raising the stakes to make a deal. And he says you all have to spend 5% of your national income on defense. He also certainly doesn't mean that, but he probably means 3%. And that would be a very big thing in itself.
From a global perspective, then, for people out with America, clearly people are split on Donald Trump. Some people, think he's a go-getter, someone who gets things done. They like the way he does his politics, and other people they feel they're not fans of him, of the things he does, the things he says. However, is it fair to say that Donald Trump, or even the threat of Donald Trump, the arrival of Donald Trump, imminent as it is, actually does focus minds? For example, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East right now. Now, Joe Biden will say that this possible ceasefire that's approaching is down to him. But many people will say, William, actually, it's because Donald Trump said, if this isn't sorted by the time I get into the White House, then all hell will be unleashed on both sides.
Yes, one can argue all hell has already been unleashed. So how different would that be? Nevertheless, yes, there is a point here that people want to clear the decks. So in that case, it might be helping to resolve a conflict. In other cases, of course, if we think about the Ukraine war, the conflict has been stepped up on both sides in anticipation of a new president who will make an effort to come to a peace deal. That's going to be a very long, drawn-out effort, nothing like the 24 hours that he originally spoke about. But that means everybody has to position themselves. The Russians have been trying to grab more territory. The Ukrainians have been striking back harder in order to get themselves positioned. So yes, in some cases it leads to a resolution of conflict, but in other cases it's leading to an escalation of conflict, the anticipation of a new president.